Now we come to the next chapter of statistics, which is estimation and test of significance. At first, consider some useful terms of statistical hypothesis. First, what is statistical hypothesis? Any statement or assertion about a statistical population of the values of a parameters is called statistical hypothesis. As assertion means, suppose we consider a test. Suppose the full marks of the test is 100. Our assertion is question is very easy. Uh, Maximum number of people get 50 or more than 50. No, this is a simple prediction. This is our assertion called null hypothesis. Alternative hypothesis is not more than people doesn't get 50, they get less than 50. This is the assertion that more than people of get 50 is called statistical hypothesis. That means we can believe that our estimation is true. This can also be termed as there are two type of hypothesis, simple and composite. The statistical hypothesis, which we can assume, is called null hypothesis. Alternate and null hypothesis can also be denoted as H naught. Alternative hypothesis, which is just a contradiction of null hypothesis, can be denoted as H1. Next, which is simple hypothesis, a statistical hypothesis which specifies the population completely. That means the definition is very clear regarding this hypothesis, which is called simple hypothesis. This can also be termed as null hypothesis, just another name of null hypothesis. Suppose, for example, Indian city, 325 out of 600 people are called smokers. This is just an example. That means more people are in a city are called smokers. This is simple hypothesis. What is its alternative hypothesis? That can be termed as composite hypothesis. Not more of the people are smokers. Now come to the definition of null hypothesis. In specifically a statistical hypothesis which is set up and whose validity is tested for possible rejection on the basis of sample observation is called a null hypothesis. Obviously, null hypothesis, which we can assume, doesn't believe that this hypothesis is true. There are some specific statistical tests which we have come later, like F test, T test, etc. A statistical hypothesis which is set up, that means it is assumed what we have said before and whose validity is tested. Naturally, if its validity is not tested, then we can't say that hypothesis is true or hypothesis is false. If the hypothesis is false, we can't term this hypothesis as null hypothesis. Then it is called alternative hypothesis, which we have come later. Now it is alternative hypothesis. A statistical hypothesis which differs from the null hypothesis is called alternative hypothesis. That means it is just a contradiction of null hypothesis, and it can be denoted as H1. Null hypothesis can be denoted as H0. That means H1 is just a contradiction of H0. Next, it is test statistic. Well, a function of sample observations whose computed values determines the final decision regarding the acceptance of or rejection of null hypothesis is called test statistic. Come again, a function of sample observations whose sample value determines the final decision regarding acceptance or rejection of null hypothesis. That means idea is very clear. We have to conduct some specific statistical test like chi-square, T, F, etc., and find out its value and then consider some range of this value. If the value is under this range, then we say that the null hypothesis is accepted, and if the value is outer of this range, we say that null hypothesis is rejected. Uh, we have come later when we have considering some specific examples. Next, it is type 1 error. Reject null hypothesis when it is true is called type 1 error. Now, at first, sometimes we did mistake about the validity of null hypothesis. There in mistake maybe some wrong conduction of test, wrong statistical value, If our statistical value is wrong, which we that means the result comes that the null hypothesis is rejected. But it is, if it is right, then we can find out we can come out the conclusion that null hypothesis is accepted. As our value is wrong, therefore we can find out the conclusion that our null hypothesis is rejected, which is obviously an error. So definition says that reject null hypothesis when it is true. That means it is actually a true, but due to our wrong estimation of statistical test, the result says that it is wrong. Therefore, our null hypothesis is rejected, which is type 1 error of statistical testing. Next, it is type 2 error. Type 2 error, accept null hypothesis which is actually a false. Error committed is actually accepting a null hypothesis which is really a false. That means which is just the opposite of type 1 error. 1 minus probability of type 1 error. This can be said that means when a null hypothesis is accepted, except null hypothesis when it is actually a false. That means value, the estimation value said that the null hypothesis is actually rejected, but in that case our wrong estimation or wrong value findings said that the null hypothesis is actually accepted, which is obviously a wrong decision. Therefore it can be said that type 2 error in a statistical testing. Next, power of a test. Power of a test is simply 1 minus probability of type 2 error. In mathematical sense, the probability of rejecting a false null hypothesis is called power of a test. Probability of rejecting in small null hypothesis is called the power of a test. Next, it is critical region, which we have come later when we analyze on the basis of such some examples. This is impossible here due to lack of infrastructure or lack of blackboard facility, etc. The set of values of the test statistic which lead to rejection of the null hypothesis is called critical region. Set of values of the test statistic which lead to rejection of null hypothesis is called critical region. Last, it is level of significance. The maximum probability with which a true null hypothesis is rejected is called the level of significance. The maximum probability with which a true null hypothesis is rejected is called the level of significance. Level of significance, it may be 1%, 5%, or maximum 10%. 10% is rarely used in that sense. Okay, these are some specific concepts regarding testing of hypothesis. Now that's all for today. Thank you.